Good day, compensation management students, and I hope everyone is well as we approach the end of this semester. So this week we're going to look at, we're finishing looking at other external forces that affect compensation, and in particular, trade unions. So for those of you who have completed IR, this will be nothing new at all, but of course we're going to look at trade unions completely from, well, not completely, but end up looking at them from a compensation angle. So that's it. Trade unions and collective bargaining is our topic. So what actually is a trade union? It is an organization based on membership of employees. That's a big deal. Employees are indeed a member of the union. And it's based on, it tends to happen in various trades, occupations, and professions. So as we know, we may have bank workers or oil workers. That's typically where it starts. You represent a segment of the industry. So again, their main focus or their major focus is to represent or the representation of its members at the workplace and in the wider society. Really, it's trying to advance the interest of its members through rules and collective bargaining. Right, so trade unions actually have many different functions and roles. In fact, they have 7 functions or roles that they whether or not all trade unions are doing this in Trinidad and Tobago is up for discussion, but we'll just run through the 7 of them. So the first one is a big deal, the political role of trade unions. And the reality is we have such an incredibly rich history of trade unionism in Trinidad and Tobago. It really is quite commendable what happened and the importance that trade unions had in actually making any change in society. So we should really be proud of that, okay? But the reality is that many trade unions in the Caribbean actually established long before political parties. And in fact, as we know right here, many of our political parties actually evolved from trade unions. So if we think about like in the 30s and the riots and it's just an incredible history, so rich with, this opposition to the current government, and we could totally understand the political link there. So if we think about it, a lot of employees would have been members of trade unions, and therefore the vote and the backing of these members is really giving the heads of the trade union some power there and some assistance to become politicians. So trade unions were able to definitely lobby for significant social and labor legislation that actually ended up on the books. So there's no doubt, especially historically, of this. Now, there are some theorists who actually view trade unions as a countervailing power against the state and private sector, in that they will always have this role that they are against or contradicting or opposing, that's probably the better word, opposing the current government. So I think to some extent we definitely still have that here. It's just very interesting how many of our heads of unions end up as ministers of labor. It's very interesting. Anyway, the second role is the regulatory role of trade unions. And if we think about how trade unions probably started, it probably originated from very early craft unions or people who were organizing maybe apprenticeships. So if we think about maybe really going back in time, like people who did metal work or silversmithing or something like that, they probably came together as a craft or a guild first, and they put things in place to regulate apprentices. So like what sort of standards of work would you expect from an apprentice? So they really got into this idea of regulating what is correct for their industry or their craft. So it makes sense that craft unions would have evolved into trade unions to some extent. But if we think about it, management is the one who has control over standards and what is required of jobs and working conditions. So it's kind of moved from this union group or this people representing its members to management is in charge of that. However, in some countries, trade unions are so strong that they are in very what we call pluralistic, is that what the word? Yes, relationships with management where the power to manage is actually shared with the trade union. So things like how we deal with discipline, how we deal with grievances, job evaluation, all of this is clearly shared. All of this regulatory work is shared between the manager and the union. And more importantly, I need to say it's shared for now and the future, not going back. And I'll touch on that in a little while. The third role is the democratizing, role of trade unions. So typically, we know that in management at work, management it's very much a top-down thing. Managers make decisions and it's cascaded down. But what trade unions do is allow for democracy. So they allow for the voices of its members to be heard through stewardships or shop stewards, committees, through the leadership, and therefore they're kind of pushing this idea of democracy, that people have a voice and people should be represented. You can't mash that. That's on. The service role of trade unions. So trade unions also have developed services which are valuable to their members. So they know that perhaps their members need housing or legal services. One of the big ones I think we can say, and we've seen in Trinidad and Tobago, is how many credit unions have actually come out of trade unions. So there's no doubt that unions can offer a lot of services to their members. The enhancement role of unions. Unions can actually enhance or provide opportunities for their workers to be enhanced or to develop themselves. So if we think about it, some people's way up through management or way up into leadership positions has been through unions. So maybe it's a shop steward who ended up as a committee member, as member of the executive, or maybe it's a shop steward who actually ended up in leadership within the organization. There's no doubt that it's a great opportunity for people to learn and develop. The welfare role of trade unions. So they're actually similar to the service provisions, the different services that they provide. Some unions also provide welfare services. For example, childcare, older people's homes, recreational centers. Maybe not so much here, but there are a lot of examples of these in the wider world. And the final one, the market or economic role of trade unions. Now, this is definitely the one that's most dominant in the Caribbean, where trade unions negotiate the wages and salaries of its members. If we think about it, in the Caribbean, the public sector is still one of the largest employers, and the public sector wage or salary is often looked at as, kind of something that indicates how the economy is doing. So this is a big deal, that what we pay in the public service is going to impact what everybody gets everywhere. So this is a big role, the fact that you're actually negotiating wages and salaries. However, we're very reactive here. We try to protect workers against, trade unions that is, try to protect workers against inflation. They want to obviously improve the standard of living. But as long as they're negotiating for periods already worked, they're at a disadvantage. So if we're now in 2019 and I'm still negotiating for 15 to 18 or 15 to 17 or 12 to 14, we are in some trouble here, because the work done happened, as well as the standard of living has obviously, the inflation has obviously happened, and therefore the money amount is just a sad scene. We need to get to the point where trade unions are negotiating for periods not yet worked, so that in 2019, I have completed my negotiations for 2020 to 2022. That makes sense? Yeah. Right, so this is another big deal, the fact that trade unions must be recognized, so the trade union recognition. So there is a registration, recognition, and certification board, and the Industrial Relations Act of Trinidad outlines what you must do to be recognized. It's not so straightforward. So we have lots of organizations whose group, let's say association for want of a better word, or people who are representing their members have not yet been recognized by this board. Therefore, they're not recognized by management. Therefore, they don't, this is going to sound terrible, but they don't have any bargaining power. They don't exist as far as management is concerned to bargain for the rights of their employees. Again, so sad. Not their employees, their members, but the employees of the organization. Really, really sad. For a while, we actually had no members of this board in place at all, so nothing could be actually recognized. Yeah. So what actually is collective bargaining? It's a formalized process by which employers and, of course, trade unions negotiate the terms and conditions of employment and the ways in which certain employment-related issues are to be regulated in the workplace. So it's not just wages, it's not just terms and conditions, it's actually a lot more. Any employment-related issue. Again, unfortunately, we seem to focus on the wages, but there's so much more now that you should be aware of in terms of benefits or terms and conditions or any employment-related issue. So how does it actually work? So the goal, of course, or the purpose is to establish terms and conditions of employment for a bargaining unit, which is who we're bargaining for or negotiating for, that both parties agree on. The union agrees and the employer, and together we come up with a collective agreement. So that's the point. So basically, the recognized majority union and the employer will initiate negotiation. They need to let the Ministry of Labor know this. They settle on a collective agreement. Of course, we know this can take years. And that agreement must be registered by the industrial court. And then finally, only upon registration does it become binding and enforceable by the industrial court. So it can last, an agreement itself can last between 3 and 5 years. So you can see there's a lot of bureaucracy here. So even if we come to agreement, it still had to get registered through the industrial court. Okay. Okay, so if we're really going to break it down now, so we know employees are represented by a union. So this is actually how we come to the agreement, right? So we have people from the union who will put together a draft of their agreement or their contract, and they will present what they want to the organization. And then basically the organization knows what it's capable of doing, and they do a lot of negotiation, a lot of meetings between the two to see if they can actually agree on the final terms and conditions as it relates to hours, wages, benefits, working conditions, rules, policies, disciplinary action, grievances, redundancies, job evaluation, as much as possible, ideally. Okay, but again, it tends to get zoned into incremental increases for the last few years. So 1 to 1, 3, 1, 0, 0. That's what it tends to come down to, but it could be so much more. Okay, it should be. So once both sides finally agree on a contract, then they sign it for whatever the period of time is. It's usually 3 years. This would be called a collective bargaining agreement, and is the final product. So we know that sometimes these collective bargaining meetings are not done in very favorable terms. It really should be, again, if we have a pluralistic approach to trade union relationships, we need to view trade unions as friends of management who can help us better run the organization, and not just look at trade unions as like being, what's the word, combative, which unfortunately sometimes they are. Again, maybe for completely understood reasons, because they have not been able to get what they want for their members. So what are the benefits of collective bargaining? Quite a few here. It allows workers to speak together as a body. That's a definite one. There are much clearer expectations between the employer and the union and what is expected. It considers all positions. In particular for employees, self-respect and responsibility. It strengthens the workforce. It increases morale and productivity. It certainly doesn't allow for arbitrary action because there are rules that have to be followed. It continues to strengthen the trade union movement. People are motivated. It certainly helps with prompt and fair settlement of grievances, and definitely better terms and conditions. But there are also benefits for employers. It helps them resolve issues rather than have to take up complaints of individual workers. There's already an established way of doing things. It promotes a sense of job security, which obviously means people are less likely to leave. It opens up channels of communication, and it stops industrial disputes. And for society, it can lead to industrial peace, harmonious industrial climate, less discrimination and exploitation of workers, which is a big deal, and of course a way of regulating conditions. So there's no doubt of the benefits of collective bargaining once they're done smoothly and with everybody's best interest at heart. And the last slide is really some of the challenges facing trade unions. The reality is, with more and more service sectors, we tend not to have so many unions that represent them, but it's coming. And then, of course, there's a very interesting angle back to what we said last week about what is a worker, etc. Is do we need trade unions that cover people in managerial positions? And then what about all the different types of employment now? Consultants, entrepreneurs, people who just work for a gig, literally informal labor. They don't tend to be covered by unions. Then the old age argument of as long as we if we continue to develop good HR, then do we need trade unions? And then finally, are we still very much an individual society rather than a collective one? And that's it.